Shakti Seer 2.
Central to this first chapter is the distinction between causes and conditions. Hetu and Pratyaya, Tibetan Rigyu and Rikin. This distinction is variously drawn and is controversial, and it is arguably differently understood in Sanskrit and Tibetan. The way I will understand it here, I argue, makes good coherent sense not only of this chapter, but of Mula Madhyamaka Karika as a whole. Briefly, we will understand this distinction as follows. When Nagarjuna uses the word cause, he has in mind an event or a state that has in its power kriya, which might also mean action, something else, something subtle. Anyway, like he said, it might have different meanings in Sanskrit and Tibetan. In Sanskrit it's kriya, in Tibetan it's bhyava. When Nagarjuna uses the word cause, he has in mind an event or a state that has in its power, kriya or bhyava, to bring about its effect, and has that power as part of its essence or nature, svabhava. When he uses the term condition, on the other hand, he has in mind an event, state, or process that can be appealed, and in explaining another event, state, or process, without any metaphysical commitment to any occult connection between explandum and explanans. In Chapter 1, Nagarjuna, we shall see, argues against the existence of causes, and for the existence of a variety of kinds of conditions. Things are not, however, quite this simple, for in the philosophical context in which Nagarjuna is writing, there are those, indeed including most Buddhist philosophical schools, who would accept his classification of conditions, but who would then assert that in order for conditions to function as explanatory, they must themselves have independent or inherent existence. Some, such as the Sarvashtivadas, or the Svatantrikas, despite other differences between the schools regarding causation, would argue that the conditions must exist as substantially distinct from the condition. Others, such as Chittamatra, would argue that they can be of the same nature. Nagarjuna would evade these particular debates, however, by emphasizing that the conditions he has in mind must be thought of as empty of inherent existence and connected to the phenomena they condition, neither through absolute difference nor through identity. Nagarjuna would evade these particular debates by emphasizing that the conditions he has in mind must be thought of as empty of inherent existence and connected to the phenomena they condition, neither through absolute difference nor through identity. The argument against causation is tightly intertwined with the positive account of dependent arising and of the nature of relation, the relation between conditions and conditioned. The argument against causation is tightly intertwined with the positive account of dependent arising and the nature of the relation between conditions and conditioned. Nagarjuna begins by stating the conclusion: entities are neither self-caused, nor do they come to be through the power of other entities. That is, there is no causation when causation is thought of as involving causal activity. So now here it begins the first part of the text, Mula Madhyamaka Karika 1-1. Neither from itself, nor from another, nor from both, nor without a cause, does anything whatever anywhere arise. And this is a commentary. The fourfold classification of positions with regard to the relation between an active cause and its effect is meant to be exhaustive. But it is important to keep in mind that Nagarjuna was aware of philosophical schools espousing each of these four positions. And each of them has something to say for itself if we begin by supposing a model of causation involving powers as essential properties of substantially real causes. Let me read that again. The fourfold classification of positions with regard to the relation between an active cause and its effect is meant to be exhaustive. But it is important to keep in mind that Nagarjuna was aware of philosophical schools espousing each of these four positions, and each of them has something to say for itself if we began by supposing a model of causation involving powers as essential properties of substantially real causes. The first view, held prominently by Samkhya philosophers, is that all causation is really self-causation. A proponent of this view would argue that for a cause to be genuinely the cause of an effect, that effect must exist potentially in that cause. If it does not, then the cause might exist without the effect, in which case the cause would fail to necessitate the effect, in which case it would be not a genuine cause. So in other words, the proponent of this view would argue that for a cause to be genuinely the cause of an effect, that effect must exist potentially in the cause. If it does not, then the cause might exist without the effect, in which case the cause would fail to necessitate this effect, in which case it would not be a genuine cause. This is not to say that effects exist in full actuality in their causes, but that they have a genuine potential existence when their causes exist. In this case, since the effect is present in the cause, it already has a kind of existence prior to its appearance. Since the effect is already present in the cause, it already has a kind of existence prior to its appearance, and it is the fact of this prior potential existence that accounts for the causal character of the cause. So we can say on this view that a thing's prior potential existence is what gives rise to its later actual existence. So effects are in this sense self-caused. The typical kind of example appealed to in order to defend this model of causation is the seed and sprout relation. The sprout, although actual after germination, is potential in the seed. Its potentiality is what makes the seed a seed, and that the seed a seed of that sprout. Moreover, on this view, the seed and sprout cannot be distinguished as substantially different. Intuitively, it makes sense to say that they are two stages of the same entity, but the seed is the cause of the sprout. Hence, the proponent of this view concludes that the sprout is self-caused. Causation from another is a more familiar way of thinking of causation and was the dominant doctrine of causation in the Buddhist philosophical milieu in which Nagarjuna was working. On this view, causes and their effects are genuinely distinct phenomena. They can be characterized and can in principle exist independently of one another, but they are related by the fact that one has the power to bring the other about. The relations between parents and children is an example often appealed to in illustrating this doctrine. Parents bring their children into existence, but they are not identical entities. The doctrine of causation by both self and other emerges through a juxtaposition of the doctrines of causation from another and the doctrine of self-causation. Let us return to the example of the seed. A proponent of the other causation might point out that the seeds that are not planted, watered, and so forth do not sprout. If the sprout were present in the seed, these other conditions which are manifestly other than the sprout would be odious. On the other hand, the proponent of self-causation might reply, no matter how much you water, nourish, and exhort an infertile seed, one without the potentially existent sprout, nothing happens. So, all of the distinct conditions in the world will not suffice absent the potential existence of the effect. The happy compromise doctrine that emerges is the doctrine of causation by both. Effects are the result of the joint operation of the effect in itself and potential, and the external causation conditions necessary to raise the effect's mode of existence from potentiality to actuality. The fourth alternative view of causation is that things simply spontaneously arise from no particular causes, that there are no links at all between events. What might motivate such a view? Well, we shall see, as any reader of the Sextus Imperius Hume or Whittington might recall. There are powerful reasons for believing that none of the three alternatives just rehearsed can be made coherent. And if one believed that only if there were either some kind of identity or difference between causes and effects could there be a relation of dependency between phenomena? One would be forced to the nihilistic conclusion that things simply arise causelessly. Nonetheless, Nagarjuna notes, there are conditions, in fact 4 distinct kinds, that can be appealed to in the explanation and prediction of phenomena. The next verse, there are 4 conditions: efficient condition, percept-object condition, immediate condition, dominant condition. Just so, there is no 5th condition. The general classification of conditions Nagarjuna employs is pretty standard in Indian and specifically Buddhist accounts of explanation. But there are 2 specific features of Nagarjuna's presentation that should be noted. First, since he is writing with specific soteriological goals in mind, which require the practitioner to develop a deep insight into the nature of his or her own mind, there is a specifically psychological emphasis in the presentation. We must be aware both of this emphasis and of the natural generalization aware from the particular domain that the account supports. Second, it will be of paramount importance to Nagarjuna that the analysis of the relation of conditions to the condition involves ascribing neither inherent existence nor causal power to these conditions. Efficient conditions are those salient events that explain the occurrence of subsequent events. Striking a match is the efficient condition for its lighting. My fingers depressing the keys of this computer is the efficient condition for the creation of this text. The percept-object condition is, in its primary sense, the object in the environment that is the condition for a mind's perception of it. So when you see a tree, the physical tree in the environment is the percept-object condition of your perceptual state. The physical tree in the environment is the percept-object condition of your perceptual state. Now things get vexed here in a number of ways. First, there is no unanimity in the world or even in Buddhist philosophy regarding the analysis of perception, and hence no consensus on the view just enumerated, that external objects are the percept-object conditions of perceptual awareness. Idealists, for instance, argue that the percept-object conditions are to be located in the subject. Second, many fans of the percept-object conditions on both sides of the idealist-realist divide argue that substantial existence of such a condition and the appropriate exercise of its power to produce perception is a necessary condition of perception. Nagarjuna would be concerned to reject any such analysis, whether idealist or realist, in virtue of his attack on the notions of substantial existence, substantial difference, and causal power. Third, within the psychological domain, the account generalizes beyond perception. Conceptual states, imagining, reasoning, all can be said to have percept-object conditions. To Western philosophical ears, this seems odd, but from the standpoint of Buddhist epistemology and psychology, intentional activity generally is the natural kind comprised by perception. So, the point is that the intentional existence of the Golden Mountain is a percept-object condition of my being able to doubt that there is such a thing. Finally, the analysis bears generalization well beyond the psychological. For the most abstract level, what is distinct about a percept-object condition is its existence simultaneously with and as support for what it conditions. So Nagarjuna's attack on a substantial understanding of this kind of explanans will apply mutatis mutandis to the case of a table supporting a book. Oh, mutatis mutandis. The dominant condition is the purpose or end for which an action is undertaken. My hopes for understanding of Madhyamika might be the dominant conditions for my reading Nagarjuna's text, its presence before my eyes, the percept-object condition, and the reflected light striking my eyes, the efficient condition. The immediate conditions are the countless intermediary phenomena that emerge upon the analysis of a causal chain, in this case, the photon striking my retina, the excitation of photoreceptor cells, and so forth. A non-psychological example might be useful to illustrate the difference between the 4 kinds of conditions and the picture Nagarjuna suggests of explanation in the most general sense. Suppose that you ask, why are the lights on? I might reply as follows, because I flicked the switch. I have appealed to an efficient condition, or because the wires are good and working order. The bulbs haven't burned out and the electricity is flowing. These are supporting conditions. Or the light is the emission of photons, each of which is emitted in response to the bombardment of an atom by an electron, and so forth. I've appealed to the chain of immediate conditions. For or that we can see. This is a dominant condition. Any of these would be perfectly good in answer to the why question, but note that none of them makes any reference to any causal powers or necessitation. The next three verses are crucial to Nagarjuna's understanding of the nature of conditions and their role in explanation. Nagarjuna first notes that in examining a phenomena and its relations to its conditions, we don't find the phenomena somehow contained potentially in those conditions. The essence of entities is not present in the conditions, etc. If there is no essence, there can be no otherness essence. The essence of entities is not present in the conditions, etc. If there is no essence, there can be no otherness essence. The point being made in the first two lines of this verse is fairly straightforward. When we examine the set of conditions that give rise to an entity, for example, the set of conditions we detailed above for the shining of a lamp, or the conditions for seeing a tree we discussed previously, no analysis of those conditions yields the consequent effect. Dissecting light switches, wires, brains, and so forth do not reveal any hidden light. Nor is there a tree perception to be found already in the existence of the tree, the eye, and so forth. Rather, these phenomena arise as consequences of co-location of those conditions. To borrow a Kantian turn of phrase, phenomena are not analytically contained in their conditions. Rather, a synthesis is required out of which phenomena not antecedently existent comes to be. But Nagarjuna, through the use of his phrase, the essence of entities, emphasizes a very important metaphysical consequence of this observation. Given that phenomena depend upon their conditions for their existence, and given that nothing answering to an essence of phenomena can be located in those conditions, and given that there is nowhere else that an essence could come from, it follows that phenomena that arise from conditions are essence-less. One might argue at this point that just as phenomena come into existence dependent upon conditions, their essences come into existence in this way. But what goes for phenomena does not go for essences, for essences are by definition eternal and fixed. They are independent, and for a phenomena to have an essence is for it to have some permanent independent core. So neither essences nor phenomena with essences can emerge from conditions. The next two lines require a careful gloss because both of the complexity of the philosophical point at stake and because of the Buddhist philosophical term of art I translate as otherness essence, parabhava. Let us begin by glossing that term. It is in primary sense it means to have as a thing's nature dependence on another for existence. For a table, for instance, to have otherness essence, according to the proponentist analysis of the nature of things, might be for it to have as an essential characteristic for the property of the depending for its existence on some pieces of wood, a carpenter, and so forth. This, by way of thinking of nature of things, has a great appeal. Was used by those who defended the analysis of causation as producing from other, and the analysis of causes and their effects according to which they are linked by causal powers inherent in the causes, particularly for other Buddhist schools who want to join with Nagarjuna in denying essence of phenomena. For such a philosopher, it would be congenial to argue that the table has no essence of its own, but has the essential property of depending on its parts, causes, and so forth, an essential property that depends critically on another. And it would then be important to note that this nature relies on the other having an intrinsic connection to the phenomena in question, a connection realized in the causal powers or other inherently existent relation to the effect of that other, and hence in the other's own nature. Moreover, it is crucial to such an analysis, if it is not to lapse in the into the absurdities that plague self-causation, that there be a real substantial difference in entity. It is crucial to such an analysis, if it is not to lapse into the absurdities that plague self-causation, that there be a real substantial difference in entity, a difference in intrinsic nature between the dependent phenomena and the conditions on which it depends. Absent such a difference, the otherness required in the analysis cannot be established. Given this understanding of otherness essence, we can see that arguments Nagarjuna is ostending in the two lines of this verse. First, since all entities are without their own essences, that is, without essences, they can be specifically, intrinsically, without reference to something else. There can be specified essences that can be specified intrinsically without reference to anything else. Since all entities are without essences, they can be specified intrinsically without reference to anything else. The other, with respect to which any phenomena is purported essentially characterized, will be without an essence, and so there will be no basis on which to build this otherness essence. Secondly, without individual essences, there will be no basis on which to draw the absolute essential distinctions necessary to establish phenomena as intrinsically other than their conditions. Without individual essences, there are not substantial differences. Without substantial differences, there are no absolute others by means of which to characterize phenomena. Third, in order to characterize phenomena as essentially different from their conditions, it is important to be able to characterize them independently. Otherwise, each depends for its identity on the other, and they are not truly distinct in nature. But the whole point of otherness essence is that things in virtue of having it are essentially dependent. So the view is in fact internally contradictory. Given that things have no intrinsic nature, they are not essentially different. Given the lack of difference, they are interdependent. But given that interdependence, there cannot be the otherness needed to build otherness essence out of dependence. Now, on reading of this chapter, I am suggesting On the reading of this chapter that I am suggesting, we can see conditions simply as useful explanans. Using this language, Nagarjuna is urging that even distinguishing between explanans and explanandum as distinct entities, with the former containing potentially what the latter has actually, is problematic. What we are typically confronted with in nature is a vast network of interdependent and continuous processes, and carving out particular phenomena for explanation or for use in explanations depends more on our explanatory interests and language than on joints nature presents to us. Through addressing the question of the potential existence of an event and its conditions, Nagarjuna hints at this concealed relation between praxis and reality. Next, Nagarjuna notes that in invoking an event or an entity as a condition in explanation, we do not thereby ascribe it any causal power. Quote, Mula Madhyamaka Karika 1-4, power to act does not have conditions. There is no power to act without conditions. There are no conditions without power to act, nor do any have the power to act. This is the beginning of Nagarjuna's attack on the causal power cement of the universe view of causation, and his contrastive development of his regulatory view of condition-dependent arising. Causal powers, according to those who posit them, are meant to explain the causal nexus. They are meant to explain how it is that causes bring about their effects, which is itself supposed to be otherwise inexplicable. But, Nagarjuna argues, if there were a causal power, it itself, as a phenomena, would either have to have conditions or not. If the former, there is a vicious explanatory regress, for then one has to explain how the powers to act are themselves brought about by the conditions, and this is the very link presupposed by the friend of the powers to be inexplicable. One could posit powers the conditions have to bring about powers, and powers the powers have to bring about effects, but this just moves one step further down the regress. You would need more powers, more conditions, more effects, and more infinitely. If, on the other hand, one suggests that the powers have no condition, one is struck positing uncaused, inexplicable, occult entities as the explanans of causation. If what is explained is how it is that all phenomena are brought about If what is to be explained is how it is that all phenomena are brought about by causal processes, it is a bit embarrassing to do so by reference to unobserved entities that are explicitly exempt from this otherwise universal condition. Moreover, there is then no explanation of how these powers arise and why they come to be where they are. This is all startlingly anticipatory of Wittgenstein's famous echo of Hume in the Tractatus 6371. The whole modern conception of the world is founded on the illusion that so-called laws of nature are the explanations of natural phenomena. 6372. Thus people today stop at the laws of nature, treating them as something inviolable, just as God and fate were treated in past ages. And in fact, both are right and both are wrong, though the view of the ancients is clear insofar as they have a clear and acknowledged terminus, while the modern system tries to make it look as if everything were explained. In the next two lines, as we will often see in the text, Nagarjuna is speaking in two senses. First, from the conventional standpoint, and second, from the ultimate. In the third line of the verse, he notes that conditions can certainly, in a perfectly legitimate sense, be appealed to as things that bring about their effects. In that sense, we can say that they are efficacious, that they have the power to act. But in the fourth line, he emphasizes that we cannot, so to speak, quantify over this power, identifying it as a phenomenon or property possessed by the conditions. There are no powers in that sense. Just as we can act for someone else's sake despite there being no sakes, we can appeal to the potency of conditions despite there being no such a potency. And this is reference to the line, there are no conditions without the power to act, nor do any have the power to act. There are no powers in that sense. Just as we can act for someone else's sake, despite there being no sakes, we can appeal to the potency of conditions despite there being no such potency. The trick is to make correct use of conventional locutions without reifying denotata for all the terms. For example, we might ask a farmer, do these seeds have the power to sprout, as a way of asking whether they are fertile? It would then be perfectly appropriate for him to answer in the affirmative. But if we then ask him to show us where in the seed the power is located, he would be quite justified in regarding us as mad. Our desire for light does not exert some occult force on the lights, nor is there anything to be found in the flicking of the switch other than the plastic metal movement and connections visible to the naked eye. Occult causal powers are singularly absent. On the other hand, Nagarjuna points out in this discussion that this does not mean that conditions are explanatorily impotent. In a perfect ordinary sense, not the sense that the metaphysicians of causation have in mind, our desire is active in the production of light, but not in the sense that it contains light potentially, or some special causal power that connects our minds to the bulbs. What is it then about some sets of event pairs, but not others, that make them dependently related, if not some causal link present in those cases, but not in others? What is it then about some sets of event pairs, but not others, that make them dependently related, if not some causal link present in those cases, but not in others? Okay, so that brings us to the fifth verse of chapter 1 of Mula Madhyamaka Karika. These give rise to those. So these are called conditions. As long as those do not come from these, why are these not non-conditions? These give rise to those. So these are called conditions. As long as those do not come from these, why are these not non-conditions? One might answer this question. Nagarjuna notes in the opponent's suggestion in the first two lines by noting the presence of some relation of giving rise to, realized in a power. But he rejoins in the final two lines, this move is blocked, for having shown the absence in the theoretical impotence of such a link, it would follow that there would be no conditions. Nagarjuna hence suggests Nagarjuna suggests here that it is the regularities that count. Flickings give rise to illuminations. So there are conditions of them. If they didn't, they wouldn't be, period. Explanation relies on regularities. Regularities are explained by reference to further regularities. Adding active forces or potentials adds nothing of explanatory utility to the picture. In reading the next few verses, we might be hermeneutically cautious and pay careful attention to Nagarjuna's use of the term existent, yodpa, or sat, in its negative contrastive, non-existent, or asat. For Nagarjuna is worried here about inherent existence and inherent non-existence as opposed to conventional existence or non-existence. For a thing to exist inherently is for it to exist in virtue of possessing an essence. For it to exist independently of other entities and independently of convention. For a thing to be inherently non-existent is for it not to exist in any sense at all, not even conventionally or dependently. With this in mind, we can see how Nagarjuna defends dependent arising while rejecting causation. 1-6. For neither an existent nor a non-existent thing is a condition appropriate. If a thing is non-existent, how could it have a condition? If a thing is already existent, what would a condition do? He notes here that if entities are conceived as inherently existent, they exist independently and hence need no conditions for their production. Indeed, they could not be produced if they exist in this way. On the other hand, if things exist in no way whatsoever, it follows trivially that they have no conditions. The following verses make this point with regard to each of the four kinds of conditions. 1-7. When neither existence nor non-existence, nor existent non-existence are established, how could one propose a quote-unquote productive cause? If there were one, it would be pointless. 1-8. An existent entity, mental episode, has no object. Since a mental episode is without an object, how could there be any percept condition? Since a mental episode is without an object, how could there be any percept condition? Since things are not arisen, cessation is not acceptable. Therefore, an immediate condition is not reasonable. If something has ceased, how could it be a condition? In 1-7, Nagarjuna is reasoning that since an inherently existent phenomena is by definition independent, it could not have been produced by anything else. An inherently non-existent phenomena certainly cannot be produced. If it were, it would be non-existent. An existent non-existent, for instance, something postulated by mind, onji, ontology, existing in logical space, though not in the actual world, cannot be produced, since its actual production would contradict its non-existence, and its production in some other way would contradict the inherent existence of some other, of the other sort of postulated for it, rather. The argument in 1-8 is a bit different and is directed more specifically at the special status of simultaneous supporting conditions such as those posited in perception as discussed above. Nagarjuna is making the following point. If we consider a particular moment of perception, the object of the perceptual episode no longer exists. This is so simply because of the mundane fact that the chain of events is responsible for the arising of perceptual consciousness takes time. So the tree of which I am perceptually aware now is a tree that existed about 100 Milliseconds ago, not the one that exists now, the light took some time to reach my eye. The nervous impulses from the eye to the brain took some time. Visual processing took still more time. So if the story about how the tree is the percept object condition of my perception, according to which the tree exists simultaneously with the perception and exerts a causal power on my eye or visual consciousness, were accepted, perception would be impossible. Moreover, the objects of many mental episodes are themselves non-existent, like the Golden Mountain. But non-existence can't be causally responsible for anything. Verse 9 contains two arguments. In the first half of the verse, Nagarjuna is offering a quick reductio on the idea that immediately preceding conditions can exist inherently. By definition, an immediately preceding condition is a momentary element of a causal chain, and by definition something that is inherently existent and independent. Hence it cannot arise depending on something else, and therefore it cannot cease to exist. But immediately preceding conditions must arise and cease. In the final line of the verse, Nagarjuna develops a related problem. Immediately preceding conditions must cease before their effect arises. If their existence and exertion of causal power is what explains the arising of the cause, the arising of the cause is inexplicable. What is important about this strand of the argument? Nagarjuna is drawing attention to the connection between a causal power view of causation and an essentialist view of phenomena on the one hand, and between a conditioned view of dependent arising and a conventional view of phenomena on the other. If one views phenomena as having and as emerging from causal powers, one reviews them as having essences and as being connected to the essences of other phenomena. This, Nagarjuna suggests, is ultimately incoherent, since it forces one at the same time to assert the inherent existence of these things in virtue of their essential identity, and to assert their dependence and productive character in virtue of their causal history and power. But such dependence and relational character, he suggests, is incompatible with their inherent existence. If, on the other hand, one regards things as dependent merely on conditions, one regards them as without essence and without power. And to regard something as without essence and without power is to regard it as merely conventionally existent, and this is to regard it as existing dependently. This provides a coherent mundane understanding of phenomena as alternative to the metaphysics of reification that Nagarjuna criticizes. Verse 1-10. If things did not exist without essence, the phrase, when this exists, so this will be, would not be acceptable. Nagarjuna is replying to the causal realist's inference from the reality of causal powers to their embodiment in real entities whose essences include those powers. He turns the tables on the realist, arguing that it is precisely because there is no such reality to things, and hence no entities to serve as the bearers of the causal powers the realist wants to posit, that the Buddhist formula expressing the truth of dependent arising can be asserted. It could not be asserted if, in fact, there were real entities. For if they were real in the sense important for the realist, they would be independent. So if the formula were interpreted in its context as pointing to any causal power, it would be false. It could only be interpreted, it would follow, as a formula expressing the regularity of nature. In the next three verses, Nagarjuna anticipates the answer to the causal realist's reply. 1-11. In the several or united conditions, the effect cannot be found. How could something not in the conditions come from the conditions? Here the realist argues that the conclusion Nagarjuna draws for the unreality of causal power, the non-existence of things, where existence is read inherent existence, entails the falsity of the claim that things dependently arise. For if there are no things, surely nothing arises. This charge has a double edge. If the argument is successful, it not only shows that Nagarjuna's own position is vacuous, but that it contradicts one of the most fundamental tenets of Buddhist philosophy, that all phenomena are dependently arisen. Moreover, the opponent charges on Nagarjuna's view that explanandum is not to be found potentially in the explanans. There is no explanation of how the former is to be understood as depending on the latter. As Nagarjuna will emphasize in 114, however, the very structure of this charge contains the seeds of its reply. The very emptiness of the effect, an effect presupposed by the opponents to be non-empty, in fact follows from the emptiness of the conditions and of the relationship between cause, conditions, and effect. Nagarjuna will hence reply to the opponent's attempted refutation by embracing the conclusion of his reductio together with the premises it supposedly refutes. 1-12. However, if a non-existent effect arises from these conditions, why does it not arise from non-conditions? How, the opponent asks, are we to distinguish coincidental sequence from causal consequence, or even from conventional dependence? And why don't things simply arise randomly from events that are non-conditioned, since no special connection is posited to link consequence to their proper causal antecedents? 1-13. If the effect's essence is the conditions, but the conditions don't have their own essence, how could an effect whose essence is the conditions come from something which is essenceless? If the effect's essence is the conditions, but the conditions don't have their own essence, how can an effect whose essence is the conditions come from something that is essenceless? Finally, the opponent asks, since the phenomena we observe clearly have no natures, and since those natures clearly derive from their causes, since the phenomena we observe clearly have natures, and since those natures clearly derive from their causes, how could it be, as Nagarjuna argues, that they proceed by means of a process with no essence, from conditions with no essence? Whence do the natures of actual existence arise? Nagarjuna again will reply to this last charge by pointing out that since, on his view, the effects indeed have no essence, the opponent's presupposition is ill-founded. This move also indicates a reply to the problem posed in 1-12. That problem is grounded in the mistaken view that a phenomenon's lack of inherent existence entails that it, being non-existent, could come into existence from nowhere. But from nowhere, for the opponent, means from something lacking inherent existence. And indeed, for Nagarjuna, this is exactly the case. Effects lacking inherent existence depend precisely upon conditions that themselves lack inherent existence. Nagarjuna's summary of the import of the said replies is terse and cryptic. But unpacking it with the aid of what has gone before provides an important key to understanding the doctrine of emptiness of causation that is the burden of this chapter. 1-14. Therefore, neither with conditions as their essences, nor with non-conditions as their essences, are there any effects. If there are no such effects, how could conditions or non-conditions be evident? Therefore, neither with conditions as their essence, nor with non-conditions as their essence, are there any effects. If there are no such effects, how could conditions or non-conditions be evident? First, Nagarjuna points out, the opponent begs the question in asserting the genuine existence of the effects in question. They, like their conditions, and like the process of dependent origination itself, are non-existent from the ultimate point of view. That is, they have no essence whatsoever. Hence, the third charge fails. As a consequence, in the sense the opponent supposes that these effects proceed from their conditions, namely that their essence is contained potentially in their causes, which themselves exist inherently. These effects need not be so produced. And so finally, the effect containing conditions for which the opponent charges Nagarjuna with on being unable to account are themselves unnecessary. In short, while the reificationist critic charges the Madhyamika with failing to come up with a causal link sufficiently robust to link the ultimately real phenomena. For Madhyamika philosopher, the core reason for the absence of such a causal link is the very absence of such phenomena in the first place. We are now in a position to characterize explicitly the emptiness of causation, and the way this doctrine is identical with the doctrine of dependent origination from conditions adumbrated in this chapter. It is best to offer this characterization using the via media formulation most consistent with Nagarjuna's philosophical school. We will locate the doctrine as midpoint between two extreme philosophical views. That midpoint is achieved by taking conventions as the foundation of ontology, hence rejecting the very enterprise of a philosophical search for the ontological foundations of convention. To say that causation is non-empty or inherently existence is to succumb to the temptation to ground our explanatory practice and discourse in genuine causal powers linking causes to effects. That is the reificationist extreme that Nagarjuna clearly rejects. To respond to the arguments against their inherent existence of causation by suggesting that there is no possibility of appealing to conditions to explain phenomena, that there is no dependent origination at all, is the extreme of nihilism, also clearly rejected by Nagarjuna. To assert the emptiness of causation is to accept the utility of our causal discourse and explanatory practice, but to resist the temptation to see these as grounded in reference to causal powers or as demanding such grounding. Dependent origination simply is the explicability and coherence of the universe. Its emptiness is the fact that there is no more to it than that. Keep this analysis in mind, for when we reach chapter 24, in which the most explicit analysis of emptiness itself and of the relation of emptiness to the conventional world is articulated, we will see the principal philosophical move in Nagarjuna's demystification of emptiness was this attack on a reified view of causality. Nagarjuna replaces this view shared by the metaphysician and then person in the street, a view that presents itself as common sense, but is in fact deeply metaphysical, with an apparent paradoxical, thoroughly empty, but in the end common sense view, not only of causation but of the entire phenomenal world. This theme, the replacement of apparent common sense that is deeply metaphysically committed with an apparently deeply metaphysical but actually common sense understanding of the phenomenal world, will recur in each chapter of the text. Mula Madhyamaka Karika 1-1. Neither from itself, nor from another, nor from both, nor without a cause, does anything whatever anywhere arise. And this is a commentary. The fourfold classification of positions with regard to the relation between an active cause and its effect is meant to be exhaustive. But it is important to keep in mind that Nagarjuna was aware Nagarjuna was aware of philosophical schools espousing each of these four positions, and each of them has something to say for itself if we begin by supposing a model of causation involving powers as essential properties of substantially real causes. Let me read that again. The fourfold classification of positions with regard to the relation between an active cause and its effect is meant to be exhaustive. But it is important to keep in mind that Nagarjuna was aware of philosophical schools espousing each of these four positions, and each of them has something to say for itself if we began by supposing a model of causation involving power of the same nature. Nagarjuna would evade these particular debates, however, by emphasizing that the conditions he has in mind must be thought of as empty of inherent existence and connected to the phenomena they condition, neither through absolute difference nor through identity. Nagarjuna would evade these particular debates by emphasizing that the conditions he has in mind must be thought of as empty of inherent existence and connected to the phenomena they condition, neither through absolute difference nor through identity. The argument against causation is tightly intertwined with the positive account of dependent arising and of the nature of relation. the relation between conditions and conditioned. The argument against causation is tightly intertwined with the positive account of dependent arising and the nature of the relation between conditions and conditioned. Nagarjuna begins by stating the conclusion: entities are neither self-caused, nor do they come to be through the power of other entities. That is, there is no causation when causation is thought of as involving causal activity. So now here it begins the first part of the text.
Shakti Padsir 2.
Central to this first chapter is the distinction between causes and conditions. Hetu and Pratyaya, Tibetan Rigyu and Rikin. This distinction is variously drawn and is controversial, and it is arguably differently understood in Sanskrit and Tibetan. The way I will understand it here, I argue, makes good coherent sense not only of this chapter, but of Mula Madhyamaka Karika as a whole. Briefly, we will understand this distinction as follows. When Nagarjuna uses the word cause, he has in mind an event or a state that has in its power kriya, which might also mean action, something else, something subtle. Anyway, like he said, it might have different meanings in Sanskrit and Tibetan. In Sanskrit it's kriya, in Tibetan it's bhyava. When Nagarjuna uses the word cause, he has in mind an event or a state that has in its power, kriya or bhyava, to bring about its effect, and has that power as part of its essence or nature, svabhava. When he uses the term condition, on the other hand, he has in mind an event, state, or process that can be appealed, and in explaining another event, state, or process, without any metaphysical commitment to any occult connection between explandum and explanans. In Chapter 1, Nagarjuna, we shall see, argues against the existence of causes, and for the existence of a variety of kinds of conditions. Things are not, however, quite this simple, for in the philosophical context in which Nagarjuna is writing, there are those, indeed including most Buddhist philosophical schools, who would accept his classification of conditions, but who would then assert that in order for conditions to function as explanatory, they must themselves have independent or inherent existence. Some, such as the Sarvashtivadas, or the Shantantrika Svatantrikas, despite other differences between the schools regarding causation, would argue that the conditions must exist as substantially distinct from the condition. Others, such as Chittamatra, would argue that they can be of the powers as essential properties of substantially real causes. The first view, held prominently by Samkhya philosophers, is that all causation is really self-causation. A proponent of this view would argue that for a cause to be genuinely the cause of an effect, that effect must exist potentially in that cause. If it does not, then the cause might exist without the effect, in which case the cause would fail to necessitate the effect, in which case it would be not a genuine cause. So in other words, the proponent of this view would argue that for a cause to be genuinely the cause of an effect, that effect must exist potentially in the cause. If it does not, then the cause might exist without the effect, in which case the cause would fail to necessitate this effect, in which case it would not be a genuine cause. This is not to say that effects exist in full actuality in their causes, but that they have a genuine potential existence when their causes exist. In this case, since the effect is present in the cause, it already has a kind of existence prior to its appearance. Since the effect is already present in the cause, it already has a kind of existence prior to its appearance, and it is the fact of this prior potential existence that accounts for the causal character of the cause. So we can say on this view that a thing's prior potential existence is what gives rise